I'm Rob Bailey. I'm a psychologist and behavioral health faculty here. One thing I've been told to point out is that our CME process is as follows. I guess you can text. Anyway, it's right there. So check that out if you want CMEs. It is also my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Anne Browning, joining us from University of Washington. Anne is the Associate Dean for Wellbeing at UW School of Medicine. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, Anne has supported the well-being of our healthcare team members and their families through a holistic approach to crisis response. As the founding director of the UW Resiliency Lab, Anne is leveraging resilience and compassion training to develop a healthy coping mechanism in our community in response to the increasing stressors we're all facing. So very topical presentation today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. Feel free to get up as we go through the hour. I get you for 60 minutes exactly, because I know there's something that happens right after this. But grab what you need as we go. I put together a slide deck. It will give me a chance to talk a little bit about resilience and well-being. I had this working earlier, I promise. We'll see if we can do it in advance. Right when the IT leaves the room. Hey. There we go. I put more slides in the deck than we are probably going to have time for, but it gives us a chance to do a little bit of a choose your own adventure. I added some of the data from the 2022 Wellbeing Survey specific to the Department of Family Medicine. Why am I excited about data from 2022? Next Tuesday, we are actually launching our Wellbeing Survey, and we've expanded to all of UW Medicine, faculty, staff, everyone across the healthcare team and our hospitals and clinics. Very excited about that. So we'll get to see a little bit of the data from 2 years ago with a lens on like what's happening now, and hopefully some encouragement for you all to respond to that survey so we can take some more action in the coming years as well. But first, we'll start a little bit with thinking about resilience. We'll first do a quick grounding exercise. And folks with forks and food, you're going to, when you work through this in your mind without necessarily having to fully settle in your chair. If you can, though, you can just kind of put your feet on the ground, kind of come into present moment awareness. It's always nice to feel kind of the chair underneath you, the back behind you. And I like to do kind of what I call a 3 centers check. It's just a chance to kind of check in and observe how you're feeling. And I usually start with like, how's my body feeling? And then kind of this notion of like, where are my thoughts in this moment? How's my head feeling? And what are some emotions? Like, what's my emotional state of being right now? So the 3 centers check, I usually kind of have folks think, and we'll do 3 breaths together. But like, how's my body? Like, what's a word that describes how my body's feeling? What's a word that describes how my head is at, where my thoughts are at? What's a word to describe how my heart feels right now? I'll give you all a chance to kind of chat with each other after a second, but first we'll just do 3 breaths together and thinking about each of our 3 centers. So first breath, ready? Breathe in. How's your body feeling today? Aches and pains. Breathe out. Breathe in. How's your head doing? Where's your thoughts? How's your brain? And breathe out. And breathe in. How's your heart feeling today? What's your emotional state like? And breathe out. Just for 1 minute only. Folks online, feel free to type in the chat so you can kind of communicate with each other. Folks in the room, if you want to just turn to a buddy or 2 next to you, what are kind of your 3 words on how you're feeling? What are you noticing? Body, head, and heart. So it's just all right, finish up the thought you're on. All right, I'll start pulling us back together. One of the reasons I like to do this kind of 3 centers check is sometimes, if between like my body and my heart and my head, there might be one thing that is really kind of weighing me down. Like my heart could be really heavy given something that just happened, or twisted knee and sometimes that thing that's in kind of the most pain or distress kind of takes over our focus. And we don't realize like, gosh, like my head's pretty clear and, my heart's actually pretty full right now. But, my knee's kind of bugging me. Like that kind of thing to notice kind of the difference among the 3. And there are times when you're like, my body is exhausted, my head is spinning, my heart is heavy, and just recognizing like, gosh, okay, all 3 of my centers are feeling pretty depleted right now. I need to do some recovery. I need to make sure I'm taking care of myself a little bit better. So just kind of recognizing that you can have a very noisy center that it kind of is taking over, but you can also have some strengths in other areas. But again, that recognition of like, gosh, when I feel like I'm kind of depleted across my system, that's a good call to be like, I need to recover now. I need to figure out how to prioritize healing. All right. I've referred to this as the scary graph kind of throughout the pandemic. This is actually a graph that comes from kind of crisis response and literature that looks at what are these anticipated kind of emotional responses after a crisis. Keep in mind, most crises have been singular events, like an earthquake or a tsunami. You'll see from the point of impact, we actually have this like, bump up in emotional response, emotional well-being. And then we get to this kind of layer of community cohesion, almost like this honeymoon phase. We can think like early pandemic, given how bizarre my job is, by like May or June, I was trying to work with Liz O on how to get lunches to our emergency department. So like everyone was showing up to try and like, help us out, which was awesome. But then you see this incredible drop an emotional state of being into like this valley of disillusionment. And really kind of when that community cohesion wears off, and we've all been under kind of chronic stress, acute stress mainly, but as it builds into chronic stress, we often see this kind of extended low. Oh, now we're back. Thank you. Especially with Delta and Omicron, et cetera. For us, like looking at healthcare workers, one of the huge challenges was that, I think we've had like 6 or 7 distinct waves of COVID that kind of came through over the last 3.5, almost 4 years. And in that time, we're often seeing folks asked to sprint when we were already kind of running on empty. Now, if we think about our own kind of cascade effects and impacts, if we think about staffing challenges and kind of resource challenges within our environments, we've seen this kind of extended hardship of kind of getting back to baseline and getting back to anything that we could think about as kind of thriving again. When I show folks this graph, often we get a couple responses. Some folks look at it and they're like, I'm actually doing pretty well. I feel pretty good right now. And other folks look at this and they're like, that explains a lot. So I would say, good takeaway is, it makes a lot of sense to not be feeling totally awesome right now. And to be kind of in this continued phase of still trying to kind of recover, find your footing, getting back into a place of kind of anything that feels like normal or thriving again. I also show this graph in that I think it's helpful when I am talking about resilience and resilience coping work to anchor it in this notion that, what we do to kind of take care of ourselves and build up our own resource pool does kind of help us on this recovery and kind of cut down on the time we could be in this kind of valley of disillusionment. So our own kind of recovery can come down to how we take care of ourselves. Uh-oh. We got you sprinting. I don't know. Sorry. Oh, no. Wait, I'll probably need the clicker. I'm giving you the wrong thing.
Sorry about this.
Here we go. What was I saying about malleability and adaptability? One thing to know is resilience coping is learnable. So instead of our sense of getting kind of hardwired, our brain's hardwired into one way of thinking or being, and then like you have kind of this window of adaptability and then you're kind of stuck. One thing we can now see even in brain scans is that basically our neural networks can actually change and evolve throughout our lifespan. So even into late adulthood, we can actually change the structure and function of our brains. This last sentence here, I think, is actually a pretty powerful one. What we think, what we do, and what we pay attention to. So there's a mindfulness piece to this as well. What we pay attention to changes the structure and function of our brains. So the things we allow ourselves to kind of focus on, thinking about, our actions. And again, like, am I doom scrolling through my phone and the, 90 seconds I have between things? What am I paying attention to? Because that changes the structure and function of my brain. And in a sense, I think this is really a good call to just add a layer of intention to where we put our attention. And in a sense, like our attention is actually one of our greatest resources, where we actually choose to focus our time and energy, and our attention is a very powerful thing. So resilience. When we look at resilience, a lot of the research that kind of underpins this comes out of initially studying kids and developmental trajectories. We've seen that, kiddos with a high number of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, things like drugs and alcohol in former community, violence in former community. For the most part, folks with higher numbers of ACEs had a much flatter developmental trajectory. But a lot of the underpinning for the research on resilience actually started by noticing that some kids, despite having a large number of ACEs, were thriving, and started to kind of, shift the question and be like, what is going on for them that is allowing them to beat the odds? And what the researchers found is that the kiddos were able to do these three things: cultivate healthy attachments and connections. It didn't have to be to a parent or guardian, but to a like trustworthy adult, to be able to cultivate positive emotions, and to be able to cultivate a sense of purpose. And it's cultivate insofar as it allows you then to experience resilience, or really, give you a very good chance of experiencing resilience. And I talk about experiencing resilience rather than being resilient, because resilience is a process and it is context specific and it shifts all the time. So it's not like you bounce back in the right way several times and you get your merit badge for resilience and you put it on your sash and you're good to go. It changes and evolves. So trying to make sure that you adapt with it. one thing I heard a lot throughout the pandemic was like, gosh, the resilience coping skills I've used before just aren't cutting it anymore. And so needing to kind of continue and evolve what you were doing became a very, very kind of good adaptation. The one that tends to be the most ethereal, I'm sorry that the text overlaps a little bit here, but this idea of cultivating a positive lens or kind of cultivating positive emotions tends to be kind of the least easy to kind of pinpoint. But one of the kind of actions you can do is actually very straightforward. And I would say that that is kind of practicing gratitude, taking that moment to kind of pause and think about what are you grateful for in your life. There are a couple ways we can do this. Um, Affirming the good that you've received, taking some time to do that, acknowledging the roles that others play in providing our lives with goodness, and kind of like that, what have I received and what have I given to? And research shows that if you do this kind of daily, it kind of loses some of its oomph. But if you practice once a week and maybe have kind of a tradition, Sunday evenings, for instance, where you actually do that pause, what have I received and what have I given to? It's actually a very positive shift, a powerful shift to kind of reorient yourself to positive emotions. What is the thing that this really does? It kind of breaks this rumination on negative thoughts and feelings. All right, so I've been doing work in resilience for, gosh, just about a decade now, which means the people around me have been stuck hearing me talk about resilience for about a decade now. I'll still get stuck kind of ruminating though on negative thoughts and feelings and things that happen that are frustrating to me. I have like partner who will be like, okay, hold up. What are like two things you're grateful for now? I'm like, dang it, because she can totally call me out. But it's that pivot to like kind of getting past the like narrow focus on the hard thing right in front of you to being able to kind of take that step back and be like, okay, this is a hard thing right here, but in this broader spectrum, this is going well and this is really awesome. So that broader context actually allows us more psychological flexibility, and it kind of gives us a chance to kind of reorient and put the hard thing in front of us in perspective of a greater whole. So my friend Polo Decano, he's a PhD in school psychology, and he was one of the folks who helped me found the Resilience Lab. He did an exhaustive literature review, trying to kind of understand what are the different kind of things we can do behaviorally to support our resilience and our well-being. Polo is also obsessed with acronyms. So you'll see down this left-hand side, this says refresher. And so he'll often hanging out, if somebody's having a rough day, he'll be like, what are like one or two of the refreshers you can focus on in the next week or two? And it's actually a helpful way to kind of orient yourself. And I'm going to actually ask you to think about what are maybe two of these things that you want to focus on doing more of in the next couple weeks. And I'm going to run through them, but keep in mind which ones resonate with you. Relationships. They take time and energy, and yet we gain a lot from kind of our connections to other people. Exercise. This is really kind of moving your body in a meaningful way to you as often as you can. I would say daily if possible. For some folks, this is going to be like taking a pet on a walk around the block in the evening. For others, this is going to be like a hardcore Peloton yoga situation. Whatever is a meaningful way for you to move your body, that is what is important here. Fun, recreational, and enjoyable activities. I used to kind of think this one was a little bit light and fluffy, but I think this was my biggest pandemic learning. There's a concept in psychology called anticipatory joy. And what it says is if you have something that you are looking forward to, long before that thing takes place, that vacation, that concert, that dinner out, long before that thing happens, your positive state of being from being excited about that thing happening, that anticipation, actually lifts your emotional state quite a bit. See, our brains can really only focus on a handful of things at once. So giving yourself something to be excited about and look forward to is an incredibly positive intervention. For me, during the pandemic, like all of my winter activities, which were usually escaping the cold, were kind of off the table as we're all like stuck here. So I ended up like buying a pair of skis and a discount ski pass and like learned to ski. And I just found myself like so excited to learn something new and to go from being a novice to like semi-competent. And it just gave me something to look forward to. And I hadn't realized how much that would actually buffer my well-being throughout a really, really challenging time. So I would say on, on your calendars in any 2-week period, something you're looking forward to that you can get excited about. Relaxation and stress management. Do you have a way of like coming back into that present moment awareness, settling into your body? Like if you can feel like the temperature rising around you, can you kind of like settle back down and calm back down a bit? Eating well, sufficient sleep. Those are two I tend to see kind of go out the window as stress increases, especially on university campuses. But paying attention to consumption for well-being is a big step. And there's tons of studies around sleep disturbances, especially under chronic stress, as many of us, if not all of us, have been in the last several years. Helping others. This one's an interesting one in that, being able to see our direct positive impact on people in our world and around us ends up having a big kind of psychosocial boost for us as well. So thinking about how we help others and actually how that feeds us often as well. Earth and time and nature. This one is actually interesting. There's research out of the University of Washington, just pre-pandemic, that was looking at how even taking 10 to 15-minute walks out in green space will decrease our kind of rumination on negative thoughts and feelings. Literature coming out of like Scandinavia and Japan, looking at forest bathing, how immersive experiences in green space actually kind of reset our biorhythms. So how do we kind of do more of that when we are so fortunate to live where we live that we often can get out into green space very easily? This last one, reason or sense of purpose. Polo often saw this kind of connected to religiosity or spirituality, but in a secular sense, it's just a connection to something greater than ourselves that kind of helps anchor us. For many of us, it could be our work and kind of taking care of the health of the public could be something that helps anchor us. And so even when stuff is hard around us, being able to kind of remember kind of the why behind and what we're a part of. An image on the bottom, if you've flown on a plane, the cabin depressurizes, the masks fall from the ceiling, and you're supposed to put on your own oxygen mask first before helping the folks around you. I think it's tricky in that we have been socialized pretty much to put a mask on everyone else around us. If there's any oxygen left in the room, then we start to breathe. So making sure that we kind of reorient to taking care of ourselves first, using the refreshers, and then making sure we can continue to care for others as well. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to chat with each other. These are a lot of questions, but I'll tell you which to hone in on. How do you cultivate each of the keys to experiencing resilience? This one I just want you to think about. How do you kind of cultivate healthy attachments and connections, positive emotions, a sense of purpose? And the one I want you to chat with the folks around you. What are the behavioral practices for resilience that you're working on improving or doing more of in your life? So for the refreshers, what are maybe 2 of the refreshers that you really want to try and incorporate more of in your life? Think about 2 minutes or so and chat with the folks around you, and then I'll bring us back together. Ready, go.
I get left from it, right? So usually I'm like, what am I gonna do? Like relationship, right? Yeah, I mean, actually, for me, I think I like
Go ahead and finish up the thoughts you're on. All right, I'll start bringing us back together. Pardon the interruption. Excellent. Humans are notoriously bad at changing their behaviors. It's incredibly hard to kind of break patterns, as many of you know. But trying to kind of, hopefully of the folks you had a chance to chat with, take this forward in a month or so, check in with the people you chatted with. Ask them, like, how's that going? Any changes you're able to hold on to? Some way of kind of bringing this forward into conversation as we're kind of building community here as well. So we're going to talk a little bit more around kind of stress and threat and kind of what is our reactions to stress and threat and how does that impact how we're kind of moving through the world. And so as a little bit of a lens into some of this, I've been a fellow down at UCSF with the Global Brain Health Institute. So I take a little bit of kind of a neurobiological lens to kind of thinking about well-being here. So how do we react to threats? Our threat defense mechanism relies on this kind of, underdeveloped kind of reptilian part of our brain so that we have kind of these cortisol and adrenaline responses coursing through us when we experience something like a threat to our self-concepts, similar to how we would feel if we were under physical threat. Hopefully not many of us are under physical threat regularly, but a threat to our self-concept, we have that same kind of physiological reaction as though we are being chased by a lion. What's really happening here? This comes down to kind of amygdala hijacking. So we get kicked into kind of fight, flight, and freeze, which developmentally, this was a good thing. Evolutionarily, it was a good thing. So that, if there was a lion lurking in the bushes, it was a good idea for folks to kind of get kicked into fight, flight, or freeze. We didn't want to be kind of processing in our prefrontal cortex and thinking about like, gosh, I wonder when that lion last ate. I wonder how fast it can run. Those folks didn't make it. So what's really happening here is that like the top of our brainstem, our thalamus is processing everything that's happening around us in real time. And then at the top of our brainstem here, our amygdala, basically as soon as a threat is detected, it kind of cuts off all communication to our prefrontal cortex. So our perspective taking, our executive functioning, all of that is going offline, kind of right when we need it most at this point. And so what's tricky is over time, that fight, flight, and freeze that did save us under physical threats, now in that kind of, scenario of a threat to our self-concept, like somebody talking over you at a meeting or somebody kind of like giving you side eye, like that kind of thing that kind of sets us off but it's like a threat to concept rather than physical threat. What we often see now is this kind of evolution of response where that fight can often land as self-critique, that flight as kind of a movement to isolation, kind of getting away from the scenario, and freeze. This is my favorite one that I tend to be quite good at. I get stuck in that kind of rumination around the thing that just happened that kind of set me off. So this is a beautiful quote from Viktor Frankl. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. I think a really big challenge of the chronic stress our patients families, our kind of broader community as a whole have been under, it has really collapsed often that gap between stimulus and response. We see heightened reactivity. I know that I have joked that I should not have been allowed to be a parent in the pandemic because my kiddo knew every single button to press and like could just kind of set me off. And it took me a while to figure out how do I kind of reset that gap between stimulus and response and choose how I wanted to kind of show up. But it's amazing, like under higher stress, it's really hard to hold on to this. So what are some things we can do? A big key to this is around emotional intelligence. All right. And a big takeaway here is if you don't manage your emotions will manage you. I can think about this in terms of, a commute to get here. You're stuck in traffic and, you find yourself so frustrated, like you might even like honk at somebody. That's kind of like anger driving your car. All right. Traffic is neutral. Traffic is just a lot of people going in the same direction at once. But our emotional response to it is very interesting that we can get mad at traffic. All right. So it's important to kind of make this shift to actually thinking about emotions as information. Right. These we often conflate, so I'll pull them apart a little bit. Emotions, they trigger a physical response in us. They're sudden and unexpected. We can think of like sound effects that go with them, like shock and awe. Feelings, these are more like a private psychological experience. Like love is more of a feeling. Mood, and this is where I think things get a little bit interesting, is kind of this prolonged emotional state or diffuse stickiness of recent events. So it's the really bad traffic you hit on the way here in which you're kind of angry that impacts how you walk in and greet your colleagues or meet with your first patient, etc. Kind of impacts your mood in an ongoing way. The Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, they did a study a little while back where they brought a bunch of school teachers together and then they divided the group in half. And they gave half of the school teachers a really positive emotional prime and the other half of the school teachers a really negative emotional prime. Then they asked them all to grade papers. As you might guess, the folks with the positive emotional prime gave higher grades. It was crazy. It was like a 1 GPA point difference. So it's like substantial. The secondary finding I actually think is even more powerful. They asked all of the teachers, to what extent, if at all, do you think the emotional prime impacted how you graded? 85% of the teachers said that they were being completely objective and that the emotional prime had no impact on their grading whatsoever. The takeaway is humans are notoriously crappy at accurately estimating how much their mood impacts how they move through the world. So getting good at kind of the 3 centers check, kind of paying attention to how am I feeling? Like, what is my emotional state right now? And honestly, how do I want to show up to meet and greet the next person, the next meeting, the next patient? How do I get aware of my own emotional state? And how do I choose how I want to show up? One way to start unpacking some of this that can kind of, take over this amygdala hijacking is start to realizing that we can actually experience emotions and feelings in our body. This image comes from a study out of Scandinavia where they had folks primed with very specific emotions and then had them kind of shade on these images, where they felt energy increasing, which are the oranges and yellows, and where they felt energy decreasing, which was the blues. And a couple things. I mean, it was pretty remarkable that one, people could identify in their body where they felt an emotion. Two, that there was some synergy around where and how people felt emotions. And I also think it's really interesting that some things actually look pretty similar in terms of how they feel, even if they're quite different, like anger and pride, for instance. What this helps us do when we start to actually understand what we are feeling in our body is that it helps us shift from this existential to the experiential, to get away from like, I'm angry, anger's driving my car, to like, holy cow, whatever just, was said or done around me, I just felt my heart rate increase. I just felt like my neck get tense. Like I'm noticing I'm reacting to something. That noticing actually helps us get past that amygdala hijacking. Because as soon as we're curious about what what we're reacting to. Why, gosh, why did that set me off so much? Why am I feeling this suddenly? That curiosity lets us get back into our prefrontal cortex and actually process. I teach and teach a lot around issues of race and class and gender and getting people to talk across difference. A big challenge there is getting people to actually recognize when something is said, notice their reaction, and be able to get curious and enter the conversation around noticing what they're reacting to, as opposed to kind of moving towards isolation, taking a step back, kind of disengaging. That reaction, I think, with my students is really like a call to engage. And that is a very challenging thing to do right now. So this also comes from the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And I have no idea why it's depicted by a piece of toast. This is a very good depiction of trying to kind of get past that amygdala hijacking that I think is quite handy. So toast person's hanging out, something happens, heart rate increases, like brain catches fire, like, all the stress and tension. Can you pause when you are recognizing that reaction? And can you see your best self? Do you have a strategy? And, something in your toolbox. And for me, I think it's like one of the ones I've really been working on is like assuming positive intent. And I actually saw it's one of the things up on the board here. Can I pause and assume positive intent from whatever was just said or done? And I want to be clear that that does not undo the importance of looking at impact versus, intent. Like I have to own my impact, but from whatever just came at me, can I pause and just start by assuming positive intent and how I respond? And from there, can I often de-escalate things? Humans have a huge negative bias, so our likelihood of making up the story of what was just said in a way that is more negative than it actually was intended to be is high. So can I start by kind of assuming better intent than is my kind of gut reaction? It kind of helps us deflate and de-escalate. So these brain images come from Ralph Greenwald, who's a psychology faculty at Eastern Washington University. And he's done a lot of studying around PTSD. He himself is a veteran. And in this study, he was looking at kind of folks who are both really well trained at kind of resilience coping strategies. And what's fascinating is then under stress, kind of seeing who was able to actually leverage those resilience coping strategies versus who wasn't. You'll see in the brain that was actually of the person who was actually able to kind of leverage those coping skills, we see kind of that prefrontal cortex totally lit up along with other parts of the brain. What was fascinating is like for the folks who, or this person who was not able to kind of leverage the skills that they had been trained in, you can see all parts of the brain lit up and almost nothing going on in the prefrontal cortex. So we can talk about, ways to do resilience coping all day long, but I think a bigger piece of the puzzle often as we kind of move through the world, move through our work days, is like, can we actually get curious about what's coming up, what we're reacting to, and really have a way of getting past that amygdala hijacking so that we can get back to kind of those resilience coping skills that we've learned and can leverage. All right. I'm going to have a couple more things and then I'm going to show you a little bit of data. But in terms of how can we foster some teaming culture, resilience and self-compassion, a good thing to know, I mentioned human negative bias, but this 5-to-1 ratio, it's actually how many positive comments most folks need to hear to every one critique to break even. I've heard the saying, compliments slide off me like Teflon and critiques stick to me like Velcro. It's really interesting. We hang on tightly to anything we hear that is a critique of us or our work. And we often kind of ignore the positive comments. If any of you have ever taught and get teaching reviews, it can be like 50 great reviews and one kid who was like, slammed you, and that's the only thing you can focus on. So noting that those critiques, we tend to over exaggerate. This to me is actually kind of an interesting thing. It's not a reason to avoid the critique, but I think it's really a call to action to get good and making sure we are on the right side of that 5-to-1. For many of us, it's probably much more skewed, but making sure we are noting the good things we are seeing each other do. Right. And that's both kind of in, direct praise and appreciation, but also in that kind of like, sharing out what we see each other doing and doing well. I've got a 8-year-old, as I mentioned, being a parent, and I read like 2 parenting books before she was born, and thank goodness one of them was pretty good. One thing that has stuck with me is it said when you give praise, direct praise to a little person, they don't pay much attention to what you're saying, but they pay attention with like exquisite detail to how they hear you talking about them to other people. I learned this is true of big people too. And I think that the, kind of helpful takeaway there is like, when I have a chance to kind of talk well about my colleagues and their work, that helps build trust between us. And so not just kind of directly praising folks for what you see them doing, but praising their work to others. When those colleagues then come into your office or come and catch you in the hall and are like, hey, we have something we need to chat about, you're in for it. You want to have that conversation. You want to make sure you're kind of growing and developing together. But it takes that kind of trust building to be able to have it. If you have somebody you don't have great trust with and they kind of say, we really need to have a hard conversation, that's a lot less awesome. So being intentional about getting to a good side on this equation is helpful. Own your own failures and setbacks, help normalize, diffuse, move forward. I would say this is kind of one of my bigger leadership recommendations. For me, I do a lot of work where there's not really a roadmap. A lot of stuff hasn't been done before. And I like to try and take a lot of risks and try things. And sometimes they work out, sometimes they don't, sometimes they face plant. And I've gotten good at trying to walk right into my colleague's office when something goes sideways and just be like, you'll never guess what I just did. And we talk about it, we laugh, we diffuse it, and we come up with a plan to try and do it better next time. And in terms of psychological safety, I think a powerful thing is when they try something and it goes sideways, they walk right into my office and say, you'll never guess what I just did. Talk about it, we laugh, we diffuse, and we come up with a plan to move forward. It means we often don't make the same mistakes twice. We learn from each other's kind of, wins and losses, and we kind of leverage the collective wisdom of each other in terms of how we move forward and what we take forward. And lastly, kind of this awareness of how we talk to ourselves and how we talk to others. I often will talk about self-compassion in this kind of talk as well. I'll jump to data instead, but kind of recognizing what voice comes up for you when you are under stress, when things are getting hard. Kind of what is that narrative? Have you developed kind of a good inner ally, or do you have more of an inner adversary that kind of pops up when things are really challenging? I'm going to skip those 2 and let's talk about a little bit of the data and well-being. So I'm going to click through this stuff pretty quick, given the time on the clock, and then I'll kind of open it up and get a chance to get a sense from you, kind of where you think things are now. And again, on Tuesday of next week, you all are going to get invited to participate in the next well-being survey, which I'll be very excited to kind of see how things change over time. So to put this in perspective, we are a part of this healthcare professional wellbeing academic consortium, which is actually where I'm flying down to Stanford this afternoon to go hang out with these folks. And it's nice. So our results, we'll get to see Department of Family Medicine here compared to all of these other departments of family medicine. So we kind of understand how we're doing relative to other peer organizations as well. This is also a really great community of practice for me in terms of thinking about well-being and interventions that we can do as a system. When we try and look at the data and the questions we ask, we try to anchor them in something that is actionable. And within this, we really try and look at systems changes more than what individuals can do. So the vast majority of the questions we ask are around kind of a culture of well-being, efficiency of practice issues, stuff that we can kind of take take kind of both departmental and system-wide action on, and a few on personal resilience. And then a lot of this is also around kind of professional fulfillment and burnout, which we mentioned in the title of this talk, and kind of this meaningfulness of clinical work. So what have we seen? We also had some open text questions that we used to triangulate in the last survey, and there will be some open text questions again. We had some institutional filters, so stuff we knew about folks, and then we had some demographic questions that we asked folks, and we were able to use that when we did our data analysis. And overall, I would say for the Department of Family Medicine, it was great. We had over 61% of the faculty respond. We're a little lower at about 30% of our trainees. Given that we have a lot of trainees around today, y'all are going to take this and it's going to be awesome, and you're going to knock it out of the park in the response rate. Rough breakdown of kind of by demographic, what percentage of folks responded. What's tricky is we don't have a total number, like a denominator, so we don't know percentage of what number in terms of Latinx folks, but we do in terms of some of those other kind of built-in numbers, like folks within a department, etc. Why we like to kind of look at this demographic data is really so that we can start to see, are there differences based on identity? Two, I'll just highlight here, maybe three, is we do see for folks who are female identified, they have about an 11% higher likelihood or higher rate of having a high level of burnout within our system than male identified folks. And when we see those discrepancies, it's important to kind of pay attention to what's going on. What can we do to mitigate that? We also saw about a 10-point margin for folks who identified as LGBTQI. Some things we could kind of predict, like our outpatient population of employees had lower burnout than kind of our emergency or urgent care. So some of these things we could kind of anticipate. It was very interesting. Our folks who are underrepresented in medicine by race and ethnicity, we actually did not see a higher level of burnout in that population than folks who are kind of represented or overrepresented. And there's some interesting thinking around why that is. So here, the Department of Family Medicine is always highlighted in gold, and you can kind of see, without seeing which all the other departments are, kind of just where you are relative to other clinical departments within the university. So here we see burnout by department, kind of on the higher end here, which is a challenge. So if the average is kind of a 3.5 across the system, we're up at closer to 4 points on the scale. In terms of professional fulfillment, a little closer to the kind of mean or median, but still lower than we would like to see. So pretty much even kind of, I would say, regardless of where you fall on the spectrum, there's kind of room to improve in all of these demographics. And it will be interesting to see from 2022 to the present, what do we see as changes across these different scales. I'll click through these pretty quick, but yeah. Yeah, so we can look at it up against all of the other Department of Family Medicine groups nationally. So I don't know if I've got the comparison data in the deck today, but we certainly will for the 2024 data. As we pull that together, we'll be able to see how you all and this department kind of measures up against those peer institutions. We're up to about 30 different peer institutions now in that group. Control of schedule, y'all are kind of right in the middle. Efficiency of practice, I would say, is more towards the lower end. And at the end, I'm going to ask if anything kind of sticks out to you on these, or if anything's a surprise. Supportive leadership behaviors, and this is kind of connected to whomever your kind of leader or manager is. So it could be your program director, it could be kind of, not just one specific person, but kind of collectively leadership within the department. But what we see here is that every time leadership scores improve, we see drops in burnout and we see higher levels of satisfaction. So this is a pretty big driver. Overall, your score was in the middle, just slightly higher than kind of average for the institution. Self-valuation, this is kind of a self-compassion metric, just a little bit higher than the median. Perceived gratitude behaviors. This one was interesting. So this is not so much kind of top down, am I appreciated by like leadership in my department? This is, do I feel as though my work is appreciated and by kind of my patients and by kind of my colleagues? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. These are just clinical departments here. Do you want to, you're good?
Oh,
Okay. Okay. Optimization of task load, lower is better. You're kind of at the high end. Task load here is kind of how much mental, emotional, and physical energy does it take from me to do my job kind of well throughout the day. So you basically are saying that your work is fairly exhausting to get through your work day. Maybe not a surprise. Meaningfulness of work, a little below the average for UW medicine. Helpfulness of the electronic health record, and this might surprise you, you were among the highest here. And so these are some comparisons to benchmark. I'll explain what these graphs mean real quick, and then we're going to go through them pretty quickly. So overall, it gives you kind of your benchmark mean, and this is family medicine here versus kind of UW medicine. And so you have a bit lower kind of professional fulfillment. This cut point, it's what percentage of folks are hitting the threshold for professional development. It's a 7.5, or if you get a 7.5 or higher, it means you have a high degree of professional fulfillment. Only 29% of folks in your department had a high level of professional fulfillment. A lot of room for improvement there. This was interesting. So we started breaking things down by faculty versus APPs versus trainees. We actually had kind of the highest level of professional fulfillment within the trainee population. You were actually higher than your benchmark mean across the country in 2022. APPs were a bit below, and then faculty were actually fairly below. That red indicates that you're more than 0.2 standard deviations off the mean. Whereas the yellow puts you within that 0.2 above or below. And the cut points here, you can see that 45% of the trainees had a high level of professional fulfillment. So interesting that that group was doing much better by comparison to the others. And this is female faculty versus male faculty just across the system, just to show that female faculty have lower professional fulfillment by and large. And when we look at within the departments, I think this is interesting that we have much lower professional fulfillment for female identified than male identified folks. So again, these are just, the data helps us ask questions and then helps us kind of figure out like, gosh, what should we do? What can we do? Since we don't want to see demographics being a predictor of a difference in things like professional fulfillment. Looking at burnout, across the board, despite having pretty good professional fulfillment, trainees still had pretty high burnout, about 45% having high burnout, 55% of the APPs, and about 62 to 63% of faculty were feeling burned out as of spring of 2022. And this is just female versus male across UW medicine. And then within the department, we actually are seeing still about a 13-point gap, but both male and female identified faculty feeling fairly burned out. And this was interesting, junior faculty versus kind of associate and full professors. We saw a pretty big gap in terms of 73% of junior faculty, so assistant level professors, were experiencing high burnout as of spring of 2022. So a big difference, though folks were still fairly burned out, but a big difference in that junior faculty level. All right, so I'm going to pause there. Oh yeah, I'm seeing some questions. Perfect. We'll come here and then there. We do have, I believe in the 2022 survey, we do have age, but in those analysis, we're just looking at faculty rank, not adding age in, but we could run the same thing by age, basically. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. I think it'll be really interesting to see which of the scales shift pretty dramatically, and maybe some that are still static. But I think you're right that like spring of 2022, even if that was kind of 2 years in, I think around staffing crises, I think that was among kind of a peak hard time. So I do think some of this is playing out. Yep. Yep. Yeah.
You have the one mic, so if you could just sort of summarize the question really quickly, that's fine.
Sounds good. Cool. Other thoughts? Anything else that was surprising? Yeah, on this. So the question is, was there a category for folks who identify as non-binary? Yeah, I actually used kind of male identified, female identified, and then a huge list. The issue being that we have so few respondents in kind of that non-binary and all other ways that folks might be identifying two-spirit, what have you. That we collapse kind of all the categories that were not identified as male, female. And we have to get higher than 5 in any kind of like reporting level to be able to pull out that data so that nobody is identifiable. So we leverage a third-party vendor, and privacy is like a huge focus. So leveraging that third-party vendor, we don't see any data come out of kind of a portal back to us unless we have at least 5 respondents. So getting to have a high enough respondent of non-binary and other kind of categories gets tricky. So a lot of the data sadly gets kind of collapsed for folks who are in really small pools. Yeah. Sure. Ooh. Ooh, I have not seen this. Mm. Mm.
They did know that mental health specialists get all these business. Really good article, and it talks about some studies that are done really citing risks. So I think the question I have is, how do we talk about mental health issues in a positive way without causing things like prevalence, inflation, and naturally lower than that?
Good. So question overall is referencing a New York Times article from yesterday looking at kind of issues of discussing mental health and how that actually can create more of kind of a collective negative experience rather than kind of a positive, and kind of a false increasing sense of prevalence. I think it's really interesting. I have not read the article, but thank you for bringing it up. I'll actually check it out later this afternoon. I do think that there can be that kind of groupthink and influence. However, I will say that without reading it, I will say what my initial thought is like, goodness, I think it's really important to make room for folks to talk about things that traditionally have been stigmatized and not spoken about, that can have pretty rough ramifications. Like as challenging as it may be for folks to talk about the emotions and hear about negative emotions experienced by other people, um, even though that might have a bit of a heavy heart impact on us, uh, the consequences of us not hearing negative emotions and not creating space for them, I think that's when we see issues like suicide increase. And, there have been plenty of studies that say talking about suicide, suicidal ideation, etc., does not increase the likelihood. I think if anything, it can kind of like help normalize the experience of having community around folks who are experiencing negative emotions. So I will read the article, but that I think is my gut reaction is that, especially coming out of the pandemic, there has been so much kind of conversation in school settings around kind of like goodness, mental health of school age children these days. Um, I can understand where it's coming from, but I actually think it's probably a positive thing. I don't think that there's necessarily not a lot of negative emotion prior. I think it's now we are getting much better about surfacing and creating space for dialogue around negative emotions. So thank you for that. I will check that out. Oh, good. Thank you. Mm, mm, mm. Yes. Yes. Yes, thank you. Question is thinking about kind of like structural harms and kind of broader systems of oppression and how do we kind of put thinking about individual resilience into that context. A slide I took out for today that I now wish I had left in, um, I think kind of tries to kind of put this into context that uh, we have to acknowledge, and I think about this in terms of moving into the pandemic and coming out of it, we did not all enter in the same space. For some, we're living under chronic stress of systems of oppression, of racism, um, and then the pandemic hits. And for others, had quite a few resources and were doing pretty well, and then hit a pandemic. When I talk about helping folks think about like how do I take care of and cater to kind of this focus on individual resilience and well-being, one of the things I try to really emphasize is this is not so that we can put a band-aid on you and allow the system to continue as is. And I really think, especially kind of given the work everybody does in this room, this is, really kind of a call to action to like, how do I take care of myself so that I can stay engaged in the work of challenging and changing the system? And I think that's really important because in the work I do, I often see people experiencing burnout who are doing the incredible heavy lift of trying to change the structures within a system. I've worked with students a long time on the university. I once had a student say, if one more person tells me to self-care my way out of my oppression, I'm going to lose it. I thought that was like such a powerful, thing for this undergraduate to say, but as like a Black woman, kind of just being like, you got to be kidding me, like to try and kind of think about individual well-being within kind of an entire oppressive system. So really making sure that we are kind of putting this in the perspective of how do we change the system collectively and how do we take care of ourselves so we can stay engaged in that work. So thank you for that. Oh, with that, we are 5 minutes over. Thank you so much. No worries. Thank you.